Hello and welcome to On the Flip Side, the very first episode of a brand new podcast designed to bring you some of the best debate in the footballing world. Now, my name is Theo Hewson. I'm joined today by Alex McMonnies. Say hello to the people, Alex.
Hello. Yeah, very excited to get started and to settle our debates in a bit more of a formal and hopefully less argumentative way, I guess.
So to give you all a bit of background, myself and Alex have been friends for a number of years now. And the reason that we found this podcast actually is because we have an awful habit of arguing about football. I always think I'm right. Alex wrongly always thinks that he's right. So we thought that the best way to try and deal with our little disagreements was in the form of a long, old conversation. Now, each podcast episode, we're going to be bringing you two different topics that we have generally opposing views on. We're going to be arguing against each other to try and reach some sort of conclusion or compromise on who we think is correct. So we've got two topics in store for you today. Firstly, we're going to be talking about the three promoted clubs and which of them have the best chance of staying up. Alex is going to lead us through that one. And in the second half of the episode, we're going to be talking about Arsenal, particularly, will this be the year they win the league? And if it's not, what does that mean for Mikel Arteta in the short term and in terms of his legacy? So without further ado, I'm going to throw over to my wonderful friend, Alex McMonnies, to introduce us to the very first topic.
Well, yeah, I mean that's a very glowing recommendation I've got there, so I'll try to live up to it. But yeah, obviously, I think it's been one of the main talking points this summer, hasn't it? Who the conversation around the promoted teams and if that gap is getting bigger between the Premier League and the Championship. And it's interesting to me that I think there's been two very, if it to me at least, it seems two very different attitudes to the idea of surviving this season and the future of these three clubs that are going forward. And I mean, Sunderland seeing the most obvious place to start. They've definitely been the loudest of the three teams, shall we say? And I think probably most people's favourites to tip the and to tip the balance and end this run of the promoted teams going straight back down. Um, and obviously, it's definitely seems to be a huge impetus on young players. And obviously, they haven't been afraid to splash the cash about a bit, likes of Habib Diarra, Simon Adingra, Chemsdeen Siabi are all really exciting players. You've got the mix of experience as well. I know Granit Xhaka is someone who's really attracted a lot of attention. And yeah, I think in terms of transfer business, if you were basing it purely on that, I think Sunderland have to be the strongest contenders to stay up. I think they've addressed their side the in the most positive way. I don't know what you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you look at their squad from the playoff final against Sheffield United. I mean, we can run through it quickly. You had Patterson in net, who's still at the squad, but likely to be a bench player. Dan Ballard started at the weekend. I don't think any of the other defenders are expecting to be starters on a consistent basis. That's Trey Hume, Luke O'Nien, and Dennis Sirkin. You've got Chris Rigg, who's obviously a very young player, looks very, very promising, but is unlikely to be starting consistently in midfield for the team this year in the Premier League. Dan Neil won't be sort of relied upon in the same way that it was last year. Joe Bellingham's gone. Romain Mundle, very talented player, might be able to get some time. And Mayenda obviously scored on his debut in the Premier League last year. But the vast majority of that team have completely made their way out of the squad. And so whilst I think that it's very sensible to buy young, talented players who can, play at a decent level in the Premier League, there has to be this consideration that it's also a risk to change everything about a team. And I know for sure that we'll both have thought the same thing when we saw this transfer strategy playing out. And that's probably going back to Fulham 2018-19, which is a window that promises a lot with a lot of genuinely brilliant signings, very good young players, and a manager who seems to be able to understand how to put them together as well. And you might just end up finding yourself in a position where actually the team just doesn't gel very well. Now, we'll get on to their first performance in a little bit, but I think, I'll refer back to you. My perspective on the transfer business is a little bit of fear more than it is confidence.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, yeah, I completely agree on the comparisons to Fulham quite a few years ago. Xhaka and John Siri are the kind of marquee signings, but in very different ways. Xhaka's got the experience. Seri was a young up and coming midfielder at that time who was highly coveted by the big teams in Europe, and it was a bit of a coup from Fulham in that sense. Whereas Xhaka's more of a more like established name, isn't it? And it's a bit mad that he's in that Sunderland side. It's also quite reminiscent, I think, to Burnley a couple of years ago. A lot of young, talented players, and that definitely seems to be the emphasis. And it almost seems to me like they've also got one eye on next season, just in case they are back in the Championship. In that, these are players with good resale value who they either sell on for basically what they paid for, or will get them back up to the Premier League with ease and give them a chance to strengthen and go again. Hopefully a little bit stronger, which, funnily enough, is what Fulham did for those few seasons when they were kind of yo-yoing a bit, and finally at the third attempts were more than good enough to stay in the league. Um, I guess mentioning Burnley there, it's a good little segue into what they've done this summer, and it seems quite similar to me, except in the case that rather than ripping up their team and basically bringing in a whole new squad or a new starting lineup, as Sunderland pretty much have, I think Burnley have placed a lot more faith in the players that have got them there and just made a few more additions here and there. Like most of their money spent this summer has just been making loans they had last season permanent. The likes of Marcus Edwards, Jaden Anthony, and Zian Fleming, and Humphreys from Chelsea as well. And obviously they've gone back to Chelsea a few more times as well with Luka Chukwu and Ambrosia. Um, and as an Everton fan, I mean, Broja I know all about from last season, and didn't exactly you know light things on fire during his time there. He didn't really get much of a chance to, in fairness to him. He was mostly injured, and I think that just shows how big a risk that sort of signing is. And I think, highlights a real issue in Burnley's side that you just don't really know where the goals are coming from. And Parker definitely seems to be reinforcing this idea that defence first, which is what has got them promoted in the first place. And I think that really contributes to that whole philosophy they seem to have gone into this window with.
Again, I completely agree. I think that they found a way to succeed last year, which was despite not having tons of firepower defending, relying on the brilliance of their individual defenders, their goalkeeper as well. Obviously, James Trafford now having moved to Manchester City, and I actually for a long time really liked Burnley's strategy. I thought the signings that they were making were players who were familiar with the club, who they knew could fit into the system. I think the signing of, I'm not even going to try the first name, but the left back Hartman, who they signed from Feyenoord, already is proving to be a pretty good signing, managed to step straight in. Again, bringing Jakob Brun Larsen back, he did fairly well for them last time he was at the club. He's still fairly young, has a lot of experience, seems to make a lot of sense. And actually, Broja, he did have a tough time last year, but consistently showed growth up till that point, up to the point where injuries really caught up on him, and has proven himself as a threat at Premier League level. And if you can get that out of him, then you're talking about a player who wouldn't have ended up at Burnley without having the year that he had last year. So there is a potential there to find a really nice player. Uga Chukwu, I think, again, really good signing. Those two players from Chelsea are their two statements. And Loon Shauna as well, it feels like a bit of a step back to last time they came up, splashing 15, 20 million on a young winger who's not really proven. But sometimes you've got to take risks. And it's felt like, except for those three, the players that they're signing are players that they're aware of. They're not spending more than 15 million on any of them. They're also bringing in sensible players like Axel Tuanzebe, who performed fairly well at Ipswich last season in the Premier League, Kyle Walker, who we know can do it in the Premier League despite concerns over his age now, and Martin Dubravka, who has always been a competent Premier League goalkeeper. Even if he is sort of reaching the end of his line now, it feels like a sensible addition. The question that has to be raised with Burnley is the players that they've lost now and how much that detracts from the quality that they've brought in. And I don't know about your perspective, but as much as I've appreciated their strategy up to now, I think they're probably in the position of having had the worst transfer window of the three, simply because they couldn't afford to hold on to the players that they wanted to hold on to.
Yeah, I think potentially. I might as well come on to Leeds now, and obviously you're a tiny bit swayed in this regard due to your own allegiances. But look, I've had a proper look at Leeds' business now, and I think looking at it, there definitely seems to be a lot of very key themes here, and that's always good to me. I like when recruitment has clear strategy to it, and I do think there is a lot of strategy to what Leeds have done this summer. I mean, first and foremost, they've spent by far the least out of the three clubs, which is always a bonus. Granted, as you say, Burnley and Sunderland have both had big outgoings, whereas Leeds haven't really too much to an extent. Um, but the links seem to be that I think I'm right in saying that every player you've brought in are between the ages of 26 and 28. So it's clearly signing players in their peak for the here and the now. There hasn't been any too many youthful signings. It is very much players that are going to come into this side straight away and bolster it. No consideration really too much of to the future. And with that said, like all fees under £20 million. And obviously, a lot has been made about the height and the physicality of the players that have been brought in. But I mean, watching Everton and Leeds in the first game of the season, of course, I've got to have a bit more of a look at some of these players. And Anton Stack really impresses me. I think that really solidifies that midfield, and Lucas Perry in goal as well. I think is a very good signing, and finally addressed the issue that has been plaguing Leeds for quite a while in Melia, who I know has not been very popular among your fans. But again, but on the flip side as well, like Burnley, you've also brought in a striker who really struggled at Everton last season, in Calvert-Lewin, another one who will most likely be finding the treatment table more than the net, if I'm being perfectly honest. But like I say, I know all too well that if you get him firing and you get enough chances for him, just how efficient he can be, and I think his hold-up play is quite underrated, to be honest. So that could very well help to thread that attack together again. Because I still think, like Burnley, that's my main worry for Leeds this season. I still don't really know where the goals are going to be coming from. But yeah, I think to go back to your overall point, yeah, I'd probably say it's quite hard to look past Sunderland as having the best transfer window out of the three clubs. Um, and that I'd say they've kind of done similar to Burnley, but I think to a much more serious extent. Whereas I think I do quite like Leeds' strategy, but I'm not sure how well it bodes if you do go down for the Championship next season. There's not a ton of resale value in there. Um, but yeah, I think overall you could argue any of those teams have had decent windows, really, to be honest. But yeah, I'd be pushing for Sunderland, I think, as the strongest, and yeah, I'd probably go with you and saying Burnley are the weakest.
Yeah, well, I think that, I mean, this gives us a useful segue into our next jump, which is basically that the way these transfer windows are going to be assessed at the end of the day comes down to the way that the teams are managed and the way that the teams operate. So this feels like a decent way to step on to the managers. And seeing as we've ended with Leeds, I'll start with Daniel Farke, who is a lot of people's first choice to be sacked this season, really. His record with Norwich was really quite poor in the Premier League. But what I will say, as a completely biased Leeds fan, and I won't pretend to be anything else, although I do think I'm pretty good at trying to be as logical as possible. I think if you look through those Norwich teams, the second one in particular, the one that he brought up and put straight back down, it's, with all due respect to those players who are much, much better football players than I will ever be, it's a very weak team by Premier League standards. I'm not sure if you've got it ahead of you, in front of you there, Alex, but I mean, we're talking about sort of Angus Gunn in net, who is a solid goalkeeper, can perform at this level. You've got defence made up of Ben Gibson, who was never really cutting it at Burnley. Andrew Omobamidali came through that season, but that was halfway through the season. Up till then, you still had Grant Hanley playing a massive role. Players like Rupp were in midfield and not performing particularly well. The front three was Josh Sargent. You had Plaqueta making appearances too. The whole team generally is just a mismatch of players who were signed from random leagues in the hopes that they might fit in somewhere. And they never really did. There was never really the backing financially for Farke. And what I'll say is that over the last 2 years, what I've seen is a manager who is very capable of adapting to circumstances. He came into Leeds when we were in a very bad position with players who, as Everton benefited from, I suppose, with Jack Harrison, players who were desperately fighting to leave on these ridiculous loan clauses that the previous owners had put into contracts. We had no idea who was going to be in the squad. And in the end, he turned a transfer flop in Jorginho Rutter and a winger who barely got time in the Premier League in Crescencio Somerville into two of the best players that I think the Championship has seen in terms of efficiency on Somerville's part and creativity on Rutter's part. He also managed to get some confidence back into Meslier enough to have a reliable starter. He had Rodon appear from out of the ether, really, after a fairly disappointing loan spell at Rennes, turn him into a brilliant centre-back. And then the summer just gone, when you lose Somerville and you lose Rutter and you lose Archie Gray as well, who was turned into a brilliant player, despite the fact that his talent took him a lot of that way. He rebuilt a completely different team with a completely different style. And what we'll get on to is their performance in the first game. And again, that was a different formation, a different style, a different build of team. And I think people are maybe underappreciating slightly his knowledge of football and his ability to adapt to circumstances. And I think that I have confidence, having seen him over the last 2 years, in the way he acts, the way he carries himself, and the way he seems to understand mentality and how to motivate players. I think that he'll see the season out, and I think there's a good chance I'll see that season out with Leeds staying up.
Well, it's a glowing reference for Farke right there. I still think definitely out of the three, I definitely think he's the most likely to lose his job. Um, I think logically from what I've seen anyway, there's much more. I think there's much more sense to stick him with Labrie and Parker over Farke. But as you said, if Leeds start the season really strongly and prove everyone wrong, as you optimistically think they might, then that's obviously a huge achievement, especially considering his previous record. Uh, Parker I think, was probably put in very much the same bracket as Farke when he came up with Bournemouth a few seasons ago, and obviously Bournemouth clearly agreed, sacking him very early on. I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying his last ever Premier League match before this weekend, of course, was a 9-0 defeat at Anfield, which is not definitely not one to stick on the CV. But I think I think he's definitely proved, just as you said, that Farke has, that he's an adaptable manager. He's clearly seen the error of his ways with that Bournemouth side that came up to the Premier League leaking goals, and Gary O'Neill was able to shore that up a little bit more and keep them up that season. And he's built this Burnley team that are very much in the image of defence first, which is night and day from what Company brought us a couple of seasons ago, and I think goes much more back to the roots of what Burnley fans want from their side. You know, Sean Dyche would definitely have been a promoter of that philosophy, as again Everton fans know all too well. And I really tip my hat to Parker. You know, I think he's proven now that he knows how to get a club promoted, and has done that on a regular basis now, and that for me is why, like what Burnley did the first season they came up with Dyche, in sticking with him and getting straight back up and being able to solidify themselves in the Premier League, having given that manager the chance. I think pretty much no matter what happens with Burnley this season, I'd be sticking with Scott Parker, because I like that their approach to the Premier League this season seemed a lot better than say someone like Vincent Kompany's was. He gets rewarded with the Bayern Munich job. I think the very least that Scott Parker should get, whatever happens to Burnley this season, is another chance back in the Championship with, as I've mentioned, a side that are either poised to be sold on or to get Burnley back up with ease. Really, I think that based on that squad quality. So yeah, I'm very impressed with Parker, to be honest. I think he's really showed himself well in that Championship season, and yeah, I do think he actually does give them quite a good chance of staying up this season.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like I say, I've got concerns over their firepower, but it feels like their approach to it is similar to Leeds, in that they are signing players who they know can do it now, who are experienced, who are physical, who are willing to fight. And so concerns over firepower sort of play second fiddle to the quality of your defence, really. I mean, we've seen it a couple of times over the last couple of seasons that promoted teams have come up and tried desperately to throw financial backing behind them. And it hasn't really paid dividends because they're leaking goals. I mean, Southampton are a perfect example of that last year under Russell Martin. They threw a lot of money at a lot of players who they thought might get them some goals, might be able to play the attractive football, a young defence, and it just didn't pay off. It just didn't work. So both Leeds and Burnley seem like that's their approach, and Parker seems particularly capable of implementing that approach as well. My concern is their start. I mean, they played okay against Tottenham. Again, we'll get onto that. But after that game, they have Sunderland next, which will obviously be a massive game, and then a run of 5 very, very tough games before they play a Leeds. And I think if they come out of that run with no points, which is possible, I mean, that depends on how they play against Sunderland and Leeds, of course. But if they come out of that Leeds game with no points or close to no points, and you're, a quarter of the way through the season, regardless of the difficulty of the fixtures, do we trust that an American owner in particular, which is what we've got to remember Alan Pace is, regardless of the good work he's done around the community. And I don't say that because I hate Americans. I merely say it because I think they tend to have a record of being a bit more trigger happy when it comes to appointments, when it comes to sackings. Will he have enough faith in Parker to turn him around? I personally would, and I agree with the points that you've made, that if they do go back down, he gives them a good chance of taking them back up. But the question will be, will he get that time? And I'm uncertain, particularly based off the performance on Monday. But I wanted to quickly talk about Regis Lebris, or Lebris. It depends how northern you want to go with it. Because I think, and I could very well be writing myself off early here with a bad prediction, but I think people are potentially overestimating him a little bit as a manager, because I understand the point about the quality of Sunderland signings, the quality of the players they've brought in, and the quality of their performance against, frankly, a very bad West Ham team on the opening day. My concern purely comes with sort of a lack of experience. I think he had a very good first season at Lorient. He was appointed in the 22-23 season, and did really, really well. Brought in some brilliant players who you're now seeing sort of peppered across the top flight in a number of different countries, including Enzo Lefebvre, who is now back with him. But then he left the following season, 23-24. He managed 76 games with a points per match record of 1.18, which isn't bad for a mid-table French team, but also isn't spectacular. And more concerning than the fact that that's his number is the fact that, you know, he was replaced in that role fairly early on after not so long of a spell. I think he had a pretty good year last year, but I also think that if you dig into the results of Sunderland near the end of the season, in the build-up to the playoffs, I have no shame in saying that I was absolutely confident they wouldn't even make it through the semis because of the poor quality of their performances in the build-up to that tournament. And I was delighted. I'm delighted that they're back in the Premier League. Sunderland, they are the choice of all the clubs that made it into the playoffs. For me, emotionally, that I wanted to be in terms of sort of being a big club that I wanted to be there. But I was massively surprised. And I think he has a good way with players. I think he has a good way of managing egos. And I think he can set them up in a nice way. But I'm unconvinced that he can massively fix a big downturn in form, because he didn't do that last season. He got over the line and they performed well in those games, but even then we're talking last minute goals. Dan Ballard getting them over the line with a massive header from a corner. They can do it, and being able to get wins over the line is massively important, but particularly when you've signed so many young players and you've got a fairly inexperienced manager, I raise the question that if they lose 4 or 5 games on the bounce and lose it convincingly, I think that their confidence just disappears out the window. And I think you end up with a team who will flounder. And I hope that doesn't happen. I want to say this very, very clearly to anyone who's about to be mad at me. I hope this doesn't happen. It's a concern of mine. And I think that the Sunderland ownership would do. I think they will have someone in mind to replace Lebris already. And that's possible the case across all 3 promoted clubs. But Cyril Louis Dreyfus has done it before, where he sacked a manager and not had someone lined up, and that didn't end particularly well for Mick Beale. So the hope would be now that they will have someone lined up, and I think that's how they'll be operating.
Yeah, I can't disagree with any of that. I think, the brief shows that he's very capable of working with young players and talented young players, and obviously that definitely seems to have been the strategy with Sunderland's transfer business this summer, as we discussed. But also has a relegation from a top flight on the TV, just like Parker and Farker do. In fairness, but and yet I completely agree with the point that they weren't exactly lighting the championship up last season either. The record is is nowhere near as impressive as I thought it would have been, to be honest. 12 losses, and obviously it was a dismal end to the league season as a whole. Um, and yeah, I agree in that, with such a young squad, is there any true real leaders in there? I know people are pointing to Xhaka's experience, but I think they're forgetting what most of Xhaka's career at Arsenal was like, in that as soon as the going got tough, he was pretty much at the centre of it all, and at the hub of negativity, and far from a captain or a leader. And it was only in the last couple of years, once Arteta remolded his role, that he really became regarded as a good player, like as a top player even. That obviously Bayer Leverkusen brought into that quality side, but he's far from, the courageous leader, I think, that will drag Sunderland through the mud when they're struggling. I really don't see him as that sort of player at all. Um, so yeah, just as an overall point there. But yeah, I think the overall point that I think I was kind of getting at the start really is that Sunderland and Burnley to me seem a lot more almost accepting that they probably don't have enough to stay up this season. Whereas I think Leeds are giving it more of a go, which is why it's partly why I think Farker is probably the most likely to go out of the three managers, purely because, as I say, if the going isn't going, if it's not going for Leeds, then I think they're the most likely to pull the trigger. Again, as you say, if they've got the right manager in mind. I know we've both spoken off camera a little bit about Ange possibly being convinced to take on the role. That's
Keeping
quite
my mouth quiet about that till it happens. That's not
yeah,
not talking about.
that would definitely be a very ambitious replacement. But yeah, I think Sunderland and Burnley look more prepared almost for the championship, whereas
Yeah.
Leeds are giving it everything they've got, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, let's talk quickly then before we finish this section about the start to the season, really. We had 2 wins for the promoted teams, a loss for Burnley. So I'm happy to start with the Burnley game. I watched this, obviously completely legally, and definitely not as it was happening. They played Tottenham, sort of exuberant Tottenham team, really, with Thomas Frank at the helm. But what I will say is not necessarily the strongest Tottenham team that you'd expect to face. This is obviously a team that don't have a number 10 at the minute. Pap Sarr seemed to be playing that role, although it's sort of rotated between him and Lucas Bergvall. They also had Archie Gray at central defensive midfield, who, as much as I love him desperately and with a deep passion, I expect most people would expect João Palhinha to be the starter there most of the time. And you also had Richarlison starting up top, who we don't know yet if he will be the starting number 9 for Frank throughout the season. But most people would expect it to be Dominic Solanke. So it was a different Tottenham team than perhaps you'd expect. And I think Burnley managed it really well, actually. Certainly, maybe for the first 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and that's despite going down 1-0 in the first 10. I think they did really well in terms of pressing, in terms of making life difficult. They lined up in what seemed to be a 5-4-1 formation, with Hannibal Mejbri sort of jumping up into attack at different points and spreading it back down to a 5-3-2. And there seemed to be good off the ball movement, really, really good closing of lines, trying to make it difficult for passes to get through. And the thing I want to say is both of Richarlison's goals sort of came out of nowhere. I mean, there was pressure, but you expect pressure when you're camped in your own half. That's just the way it goes. And it took some real skill from Kudus in both cases to get the ball into the box at all. And I think both finishes are pretty startling too. These aren't clear-cut chances that just open themselves up for him. These are things that both chances required real quality finishes. And as much as you have to expect that quality in the Premier League, it's also the case that there's only so much you can do. And I didn't come out of that game thinking that Burnley looked weak or that they looked easy to play through. I just had my concerns about the lack of firepower going forward hammered home is sort of how I felt. I think they competed well. They were physical. They managed to stay in the game up until sort of Brennan Johnson's winner. I say winner, the third goal, where the game felt like it was done and everyone just sort of dropped back on the intensity a little bit. I thought they competed fairly well. And the question for me will be, when they come up against a team like Sunderland, who we'll talk about next, will they be able to attack a bit better? Will they be able to keep those lines a bit tighter and keep those chances few and far between, so that hopefully lower quality players, lower quality attackers can find the space to make the crosses that Kudus did and find the ability to finish in the way that Richarlison seems to find once every 6 games?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's very interesting. Obviously, with Burnley and Sunderland has a match coming so early on in the season. I think that game will really be the big indication as to what these two teams are at, because you have on the one hand, as you say, Burnley coming up against a new, really invigorated Tottenham side, new manager, a few new signings in there. Kudus really impressing, and a rare appearance from Richarlison and him playing right in his peak. And Burnley were just caught up in that really. If that result happens during the season, then no one's really raising too much of an eyebrow. It's just obviously the first look at them we get. Whereas Sunderland were very much on the opposite end of the spectrum, coming up against a West Ham side that are just a complete and utter circus at the moment. Really, optimism is very low. Fans are very unconvinced by Potter. And with Sunderland, with the euphoria of finally being back in the Premier League, a stadium of light just absolutely bouncing. It was just too much for West Ham, and Sunderland really rode that wave of momentum that a playoff victory brings, and I think really showed that when it all comes together, that there is a very good side in there, but it's when that momentum runs out, as we mentioned there, that these players are going to have to stand up and be counted. And with the youth and inexperience in there, I'm not so entirely sure that's going to be the case. But it's a very strong start from Sunderland, absolutely. And yeah, I'm sure they'll be absolutely delighted with the start they've made. And I'll let you crow over your side's opening day exploits now. Then I guess.
Yeah, so just quickly, I want to say about Sunderland before we talk about Leeds is I think what they implemented was something that all 3 teams seem to be setting out to do, which is counter-attack. I mean, the stats against West Ham aren't that one-sided at all. Actually, West Ham had better possession, created as many shots. I mean, lower quality potentially, but what Sunderland did was counter-attack well, counter-attack effectively, and score those attacks as well. So you saw that with Burnley too. That was very much their plan. Camp deep, try and counter-attack. But I think with Leeds, particularly in the first half, you saw a desire to have the ball. You saw a desire to try and force teams back, try and get them to camp back. But equally, when they lost the ball, instead of this super aggressive high press, which we might have seen from Leicester at various points last year, we definitely saw from Burnley under Company. We absolutely saw from Southampton under Russell Martin too. They would instead do what the other 2 teams did, which was condense. You might have 1 or 2 players generally trying to force the ball down certain avenues, but in general, you push your back 4 together, you push your midfield 4 together, you sort of sacrifice some space down the wings, and you let the opposing team try and find a way through you. And Leeds managed to do that well. And I think particularly at the end, that 5-6, well, it was a 7 minutes added on, as well as the 5-6 minutes that came after the penalty was scored. Leeds managed to really, really effectively basically defend their box and then launch counterattacks. That they had some of their best chances in the game coming after that penalty. And I think that's going to be the key for all 3 teams. I think Leeds showed a very good propensity for doing it. I think Sunderland showed an excellent ability on the counterattack to find these brilliant, exciting young wingers that they've managed to unearth. You saw that a little bit with Company's Burnley, that, Koleosho and Odebear, in a team that were generally pretty dreadful across the board. Koleosho looked phenomenal until he got injured and Odebear got a move to Tottenham. I think all 3 teams can take different things out of their performances. Burnley will obviously be the most concerned because they are the ones who lost. But I think from all 3 teams, you've seen this desire to actually be fairly sensible and be fairly conservative with the ball and with the risks that you take. Leeds showed a real ability to do it, I think. And that's the thing that sort of influenced my opinion of Farke as well when I was talking before, how well he adapts to a new style. It was a completely new system, completely new setup, and a completely different way of playing as well that they've used over the last 2 years in the Championship, and they did it well. But we do need to bring this to an end because we've got Arsenal to talk about, which is no small task in and of itself. So let's try and come to a compromise or a conclusion for this. Tell me, Alex, as briefly as you can, whose strategy do you think will work best in terms of keeping them in the Premier League? We've talked a lot about the differences in each one. Give me one club, Leeds, Burnley, Sunderland, and then tell me the worst, the least likely to as well.
Well, I think I'm gonna have to agree with you here, and I think I'm gonna have to say it's Leeds. I think Leeds, as I've said, look the most prepared, or at least almost the most reliant on staying up this season, if that's the right word to use. I think their business strikes a lot more about the here and the now. And I think, as I say, getting off to a winning start is always brilliant. But, I'm sure even with that, none of you are looking forward to next week going against Arsenal away. There's a very good chance you could get absolutely spanked there. And, all the reassurances about your defence could very well dissipate there. But I think for both you and Burnley early on, um, I wouldn't panic. I think it's. I think the opening games, Burnley in particular, have some very tricky ones in there, and obviously have already faced a very tricky side. So yeah, I think Sunderland need to make the strongest start. I think to give themselves the best chance. But overall, based on the summers they've had and stuff, I think I'd have to back Leeds as my most likely, and probably Burnley as my least likely.
A conclusion, then, there for you. No compromise needed. So we're going to jump straight onto our second topic, which is Mikel Arteta's Arsenal. Now, I'll introduce this one for you a little bit, just to give you a bit of context. Over the last 3 full Premier League seasons, Arsenal have finished second each time, making them the first team in Premier League history to finish second 3 seasons in a row since Arsenal last time they did it. So they have shown an ability to be performing at the very top of the table. However, Mikel Arteta hasn't won a proper trophy since his very first season in charge at Arsenal. There are questions being asked now about his future. There are also a lot of people predicting them for the title this season. So I put it to you, Alex. It is my opinion that Arsenal will win the Premier League this season. You disagree. Why don't you take it away on this one? Talk us through some of your logic.
Well, straight away, after those 3 seasons where they finished second, they went on to win the league and the double, which I think we can almost completely rule out here. I'd be very surprised if they managed to pull that one off here. But yeah, I feel almost like my overall sense is that the chance has almost already passed them by. I think last season they needed to have a summer like they've had now because, to be honest, I've actually been pretty impressed with their business this summer. I think Zubimendi's a brilliant signing. I think Norgard's a very capable backup there. I think that's a big improvement on the Partey and Jorginho like sort of rotation they had last season in that position. And obviously they finally addressed the striker issue, bringing in Victor Gyökeres, a guy who's very much in his pomp, and off the back of 2 outstanding seasons with Sport in Lisbon. But I like I said, I think this summer should have happened last year, and I think the striker should have been Isak. When his price tag is through the roof now. Obviously, that saga keeps rumbling on between Liverpool and Newcastle, but if he is going to leave, it's going to be for a lot more than I think Arsenal would have had to pay for him last summer. I think 100 million would have done it, and I think that would have paid for itself over tenfold. I think that would have been more than enough for them in a Premier League season that was really lacking quality last season, particularly at the top. I think that would have been more than enough for them to take advantage of City's slip and for Liverpool getting in a decent season. But I think Arsenal would have had more than them last season if they had made the signings and the quality of signings that they've made this summer. And I think the other 2 teams, Liverpool and City, are pretty much an established top 3 now, have been for the last few seasons. I think their business has been better, and I think there's a sense of desperation about Arsenal now. I think it's almost like we need to do this sooner rather than later. Whereas City pretty much know that this season is going to be an improvement on last year, and Liverpool are just coming off the back of winning a title and have a lot of new, exciting young players to bed in. And I think I'd like to think their fans will have a lot of patience if it doesn't exactly click this season, because that's a new spine right there that could well be Liverpool's like star like spine for the next 5 years. So yeah, I think it's almost it's going to come down to mentality more than quality. You could probably argue maybe that Arsenal have the strongest squad in the Premier League now, potentially on paper. They have a lot of very settled players in there now, but I think it feels for me like the ship has sailed really, and the opportunity has passed them by.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned their squad there, so let's talk about their team firstly a little bit. As you say, that there is a very strong argument that they have the best, if not one of the best, certainly squads in terms of how settled it is, how functional it is, and sort of there's no real risks, even with Man City signings this year and Liverpool's, which we'll talk about both of those squads a bit more in a second. There are players in there who you're not quite sure how they'll work out. And the only one that you can really say that for this year is Gyökeres. And that is purely because of the fact that Arsenal have functioned without a real number 9 for a number of years. But I think if you look at their depth, I mean, defence it speaks for itself. The fact that Calafiori started and scored against Manchester United this week, and they have Miles Lewis-Skelly, who looks very likely to be England's starting left back for the next couple of years and has performed well in an England shirt already in his very young career. Him sat on the bench, that's obviously great. Being able to flick between Ben White, who I think is one of the most underrated defenders in the Premier League, and Jurriën Timber too, both of whom have an equal right to start. And then you've got a very settled, probably the best defensive pair in the Premier League currently, definitely, potentially going back to the inception of the Premier League if they maintain this for another couple of years in Saliba and Gabriel. And again, you also have players like Christian Mosquera, who they've just signed, Calafiori, who can play there, and Ben White and Timber and Kivior, who can all function in that back line. Midfield, I think, as you say, I think they've strengthened pretty impressively. Ødegaard being backed up by Waneri, now who we know is an incredible talent based on his performances in Saka's stead last year. Marino performed brilliantly as a striker and does have this ability to operate as a metronome as well. I think those are both great. And obviously, as you mentioned, Norgard as a backup for Zubimendi too. Feels like there's depth there. There's question marks over left wing for me. I'm not as convinced on Martinelli and his potential as I was a few years ago. But even there, you've brought in a good young winger in Nodi Madueke who has proven his ability in the Premier League before. So the question comes down to Gyökeres. I know we both have our opinions on him. He is obviously the big topic for Arsenal this season, particularly after his performance against Man United not being great. So what do you think about the signing of Gyökeres, and how do you think he'll settle in by the end of the season?
I'm really undecided. I keep flipping quite a bit, to be honest. I think I can't see him having like an abysmal season, and I think he'll at least register 10 goals, maybe 15. I can't really see him getting over that. I think I think it's going to take a lot of adjustment. I think we saw that against United that he didn't look particularly comfortable like in new surroundings. There's such an amount of pressure on his shoulders. I struggle to think of anyone else in the Premier League with more pressure on his shoulders right now than Victor Gyökeres has, because as we say, he's needed to be that he's been the signing Arsenal have been after for so long now that, and with the price tag here in his pomp, like reaching right into his prime now, 27 years old, you'd say, the pressure really is on him to hit the ground running and be the man to get Arsenal that title. So, and I just he's been so good at Sporting Lisbon, but hasn't played in a top five league whatsoever yet, and it is quite a big jump up, I think, for him. And yeah, I think my instinct is it's not going to be enough.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a completely legitimate point of view. I think it's tough to assess after one game, particularly when we consider that it wasn't a case of Gyökeres being bad against Manchester United. It was Arsenal going forward in general were bad. I actually thought he battled really well with Matthias de Ligt. I thought you got to see some of the physicality that he brings and that made him so famed in Lisbon in particular. That thing of a ball being pumped down the sideline, him chasing it and then managing to get a shot off or win a penalty, which he would then usually convert as well. I think you saw quite a lot of that potential. My question when they signed him was, Is that Arteta's style? And my answer at the minute is no. I don't think that is. I was surprised that they went with him. I think the reason they did was because he's older, he's experienced. They're not going to have to wait for him to mature. The player they're signing is sort of the finished version of Gyökeres. That's what he is, and he's a good finisher if nothing else. There have been chances missed over the last few years that he would put away, and those chances, it can be argued with a difference between second and first across a couple of seasons. So they'll be hoping that he works out. I think he will. I'm confident enough in his mentality. I think the bravery of dropping down to Coventry, turning that into a startling season for a club that weren't expected to do very much, and then getting a move to Lisbon when there were offers of Premier League moves, deciding to move abroad instead, find himself a home under a very good manager who, ironically, he made his debut against, obviously, this weekend. And fighting his way to the Premier League that way. I think mentality-wise, I'm confident in his ability to back himself and keep improving. But the question is, will he bring enough to carry him over the line against the opponents? The big opponents are Manchester City and Liverpool, of course. So I'll do a little bit on Liverpool's squad first, if that's all right, and then I will throw to you for your opinion on both. But Liverpool, there's been a lot of talk about, and my fear with Liverpool is similar to my fear, as I said, with Sunderland, is that it feels very much as though they're chopping and changing quite a lot. That's not concern number one. The players that they've brought in are unbelievable. This is in no way a criticism of any of those. I think Wirtz is a unique talent. Ekitike is a player I am delighted to watch and delighted in watching at Frankfurt. Was really surprised that PSG didn't work out for him because he felt like exactly the sort of player that they were working towards. If they get Isak as well, that's obviously ridiculous. I think Kirkez has been one of the best left-backs in the Premier League for a couple of seasons and can continue to do that at Liverpool. Frimpong is desperately exciting down the right-hand side. I think there's so much excitement there, and for such good reason. Gakpo as well, I think, is an underrated player. But that is an entirely new front line. Two massive shifts to the fullback areas. And if you think back to that season under Klopp, where Liverpool's most used centre-back pairing basically became Nat Phillips and Reece Williams, the problem was centre-back depth, and that is a massive problem for them now. They have Van Dijk, they have Konate, and they have Joe Gomez. And Van Dijk generally misses a couple of games each season at the minute, particularly with his age getting to be the point that it is. Konate is fairly injury hit as well, and Joe Gomez, bless him, I think could have been one of the best centre-backs England has ever created if he'd had an injury-free career and had managed to deliver on the promise that he's shown at various points over the course of his career. I think they are one centre-back injury away from just not being able to win the league this year. I think it's as simple as that. And as much as I have faith and hope that their attacking players will be able to carry them through some of it, and belief in Arne Slot as well, I think that the risk that they're taking at centre-back, combined with the fact that it's Slot's second year, and as you saw with someone like De Zerbi, the second year for managers tends to get a bit tougher while teams sort of have figured out a way to adapt. I think those are the two big things that sort of make me wary of Liverpool's chances this year. And I have them finishing third at the minute. So I'm not saying that this is going to be a crisis for them. But I think if at any point you have a position where all three of Van Dijk, Konate and Joe Gomez are out, and you're looking at players like Tsimikas and Robertson and Endo to start at centre-half, I think you are creating a whip for your own back, to be honest. And that is a concern for me. But I digress anyway. What do you think about Liverpool's chances this year, and lead us into Man City as well, who obviously have had a pretty big window themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, as you say, I think Slot very much was sticking last summer, and this summer he's very much chosen to twist. And this side is a lot more in his own image now, I think, and it almost feels a little bit like a transitional season again for Liverpool. I'd say. I think like Sunderland and Burnley that we've spoken before, they've almost got one eye on the future rather than this season itself. I think the fans have got to be a little bit patient with some of these players. I think, Ekitike seems to have hit the ground running. Obviously, goal in the Community Shield and on the opening day against Bournemouth. Whereas, the likes of Wirtz hasn't quite got as involved yet. Kirkez looks a little defensively shaky, I'd say. Frimpong, as you say, still looks very exciting for them. But yeah, I said there's no doubt in that the squad has a lot of quality now, and they're going to score a bucket load of goals this season. but they do look very shaky defensively to me. I think the midfield seems very attack minded. There's no one really properly sitting in there. It seems to be either Szoboszlai or Gravenberch who are really attacking midfielders, if we're being honest, but have kind of been pushed back a little bit. And I honestly think Van Dijk's looking worse by the week, to be honest. And that might be Everton biases coming in a little bit and finally preying on the downfall of a man who has stopped us nicking derbies so many times over the years. But I do genuinely think that age is getting to him now, and as you say, I think I'd almost argue getting someone like Mark Gahey in is more important than getting someone like Isak in, because you've got Salah there who's good for 20, 25 goals a season minimum, provided he stays fit. I think Ekitike will score loads, and I'd want to see Liverpool putting their trust in him, to be honest, and making him the main man, along with potentially Wirtz, provided, as I'm sure he will, his form begins to pick up and he begins to settle into the side more. Um, so yeah, I have Liverpool in second, and I do. And that is probably just down to, like I say, the fact that I just think there's so much more goals in this squad than Arsenal's have. Arsenal obviously have the stronger defence, the much stronger defence in my opinion, but Liverpool will just outscore so many opponents this season. It does almost seem to be that mentality of um, you score as many as you like, we're just going to score more than you, which is obviously going to be very exciting for their fans. But I'm just not quite sure it's going to be enough to get them over the line, because obviously out of these three, I have City to win the league this year. Um, I think their business has been a lot more astute than Liverpool's kind of flash signings. Um, and as you know, similarly to Arsenal, I guess, have addressed the key issues really. They've needed a left back for so long. I don't think Guardiola's ever really played with a proper functional left back since the notorious Benjamin Mendy, if you're going all the way back to that. So Aït-Nouri, I think, is a brilliant signing for them. He looks very settled in his first game against his old club on the weekend. Obviously, Reinders stole the show and just looks sublime. Older than I realised. I think he's kind of come onto the scene a little bit late. I think impressing at AC Milan, but 27 years old, so right in his prime, and I think a very reasonable fee for a player who I think is going to be key for them this season. And it's still the case of like Guardiola players seem to like take a year or two to settle and then suddenly just burst into life. And I can see the likes of Jeremy Doku and Nico Gonzalez having seasons like that this year. Obviously, Marmoush hit the ground running coming in January. I think he'll continue to be brilliant. And obviously, Rodri still got to come back to that side. Obviously, a lot of people attributed, the kind of dip in fortunes for City last season to Rodri being out for most of it. I think once he comes back in, like the side will be ticketed again, and I think we'll see City bouncing back to their old selves really, and winning the league. That's my prediction.
I think Man City just don't have the same quality there that they did at one point. If you look back at various squads where you saw Company and Stones as one option and Laporte and Diaz as an option on the other side, you now have Diaz, who is the guaranteed starter regardless of who else is fit. John Stones started this week. He's 31 and has barely played football over the last couple of years. As great as I genuinely believe he's one of the best English centre-backs that we've produced as a nation, certainly in recent history. But behind them, you have Akanji, who is 30 and has looked generally pretty good. A very good, cheap signing from Dortmund when he came in, but probably you don't want to be putting the whole defence on his back. Same with Nathan Ake, a sensible backup centre-back signing who shouldn't be starting every game. Vardiol injured, has looked vaguely shaky at centre-back when they've played him there and doesn't feel like he should be the option at left-back for the long term, really. You've got Nunez looks to be the starting right-back when they're going forward a bit more, either him or Rico Lewis. Depends, obviously, if Lewis goes. I just think depth-wise, again, if you have a couple of injuries there, I have questions. And if we're in the position where James Trafford is the starting goalkeeper instead of Ederson, then I think if you go down to James Trafford and a second choice defender or second choice defence, I think the issues that you're going to have is not really having a clear leader back there when Diaz isn't fit. Whether or not that's enough to stop them winning the league is opinion based, and my opinion is, and we'll come to our proper conclusion in a second, but my opinion is that I think Arsenal's stability, the fact that Arteta seems to understand player mentality, seems to understand how to grind out wins, how to make a team look intimidating, because I think Arsenal are the team that I least want to play, to be completely honest, partially because I think it's going to be a boring game, but that's sort of the point. The point is to suffocate teams, and they do that better than anyone. It's why they don't have to score as many, because they don't concede and they just suffocate you. And in my head, there has to be a point where that suffocation actually results in someone dying, so to speak, which in this case is winning the Premier League. So part of it, I think that analogy got away from me a little bit. But we'll talk very quickly about our conclusions in a second. I just want to ask you before we get to that, Alex, the big one. If Arsenal don't win the Premier League potentially, or certainly any trophy, is that the end for Arteta at Arsenal, firstly? And secondly, should it be the end of Arteta at Arsenal?
It's so difficult, I think, for some reason, to just imagine Arsenal not having Arteta now. He's so integral to everything they are now. It's quite hard to imagine just how down in the doldrums they actually were when he came in. So I just it just doesn't feel right in my head now, Arteta not being Arsenal manager. It almost feels like the stranglehold that Wenger held on that position now, even though obviously it's such a shorter time period. So I'd be hesitant to say that it definitely will be the end for him if this season isn't the title winning one. But I think the pressure is so intense on the club and Arteta as an individual now that it could very well be, because this project is going on for longer and longer. It's the word he keeps using. Um, and all the pressure is on them this year. I don't think there's any real pressure on Liverpool. I think having just won the league, and as I've mentioned, almost feels like a transitional season, really. Give these young players time to bed in, and they'll be exciting this season no matter what happens. Even if they lose a few games, they'll have some incredible days to remember, and absolutely wipe the floor with some teams, which will get Anfield excited. I have the feeling, just kind of away from things, this is very just instinct, kind of feel it in my gut a little bit, that I just had the feeling Guardiola during this season, like Klopp did, is just going to say, this is going to be my last season. I'm leaving in the summer, and this will be my last season at Man City after 10 years. And I just have the feeling that's going to be what spurs them on and gets them over the line at the end. So that's just a bit of a hot take for you there, I guess.
No, it's certainly interesting, and I mean, interesting, of course, that the reverse ended up happening for Klopp. It felt very much as though he'd taken over the narrative, and the players couldn't quite respond to that. Although obviously there were other issues with the team. Yeah, I want to finish on this thing about titles, and I don't think anyone can argue that Arteta hasn't been a massive success as Arsenal manager. I think it would be outrageous to suggest otherwise. And I understand the obsession with trophies. I completely do, and completely hear the argument that Arsenal should have won one by now, certainly one more recently than they have. But I think to not call him a success, considering just how naff Arsenal were when he arrived, and the fact that they were naff as well, not under some ridiculous manager, but Unai Emery, who's done a wonderful job at Aston Villa and is a good manager. The turnaround that you've seen in terms of him managing the entire club, finding the right signings, finding the right strategy forward, he has changed Arsenal in the modern era and changed them significantly for the better. He has put in two definitely unbelievable seasons in 2022-23, where they had 2.21 points per game, 23-24 when they had 2.34 points per game and still came up short. Those are seasons that would be title-winning seasons in many other years. And that's not a trophy. And that doesn't mean that, it's, something that should be massively celebrated. But I think if you undermine it by saying, they didn't win anything, though, it's stupid. It doesn't take away from the achievement that they achieved on the pitch. I wouldn't sack him at all. And I would, in fact, trust him to lead another rebuild rather than trying to find someone else and moving on. Having said that, for his own legacy, if he doesn't win a trophy soon, that pressure will become too much, will start detracting from the on-pitch performance, and will probably build too much of a narrative that for him to ignore. He won't be able to stay there, and he will probably end up having to find a job where trophies are easier to come by in a different division somewhere. I think he'll be aware that he needs to win something this year, and I think he will want it to be the Premier League. But I think if we get to January and they are pretty far behind, I would be shocked if he doesn't start throwing out some second teamers basically in the league to try and protect everyone that he can to get them to the later rounds of the FA Cup or the Champions League or both, and try and get some trophies on the board. But anyway, it's time for the conclusion / compromise. Alex, can we come to a conclusion? Do we both think Arsenal are going to win the league this year? It doesn't feel like that's the case.
No, it definitely isn't. I just don't feel it. I don't feel it. I think the pressure is just too much for them. I just want to end on a hypothetical though, a bit of a hypothetical in that
Go for it.
say as you mentioned just there that Arsenal's league campaign does fall away pretty quickly, say by January, and they decide to put all their eggs into the Champions League basket, as you know they potentially did last season, I think to an extent. Obviously having that amazing night against Real Madrid and at the Bernabeu as well, of course. So say the league campaign completely capitulates and they finish, I don't know, fifth, somewhere ridiculous like that, which would be absolutely mental, of course. I can't see any world where that happens. But they get to the final or even win the Champions League, then it's almost like the Postecoglou situation last season, really. But Arteta surely still keeps his job there, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think, look, the answer comes from what they end up achieving, and if they make it to the Champions League next year, that's a successful season. And with the quality of the people that they're competing against, it would be crazy to say that it's not. The top four is as up in the air, as congested as it feels like it has been in years. I mean, we saw last year teams like Aston Villa, teams like Newcastle really on the edge of doing it. Brighton feel like they're constantly strengthening. Same with, Bournemouth as well. You have a number of teams who it feels like could randomly make the jump up and challenge for that position this year. And if Arsenal achieve Champions League football, it's a success because that's the biggest tournament in the world in terms of prize money, in terms of importance to clubs. That's a success. And as much as a trophy is important this year, the key thing, cut that out, fans. As much as a trophy is important this year, the key thing is achieving the ability to play in the competitions that guarantee financial independence for the club, basically, and guarantee good rewards, and guarantee that the club manages to keep its place amongst the top four rather than capitulate and fall apart in the way that Man United have done over the last couple of years, and the way Tottenham have done over various years as well. Arsenal have been the most steady of all the clubs in the top four, really, particularly after last season with Man City falling apart a bit, Klopp having a tough season with Liverpool or two. Arsenal have been, since 2021, they've been fifth, second. That's incredibly consistent, and I expect them to be around there this year as well. But that is all for now. So thank you very, very much for listening to the very first episode of the On the Flip Side podcast. We hope you've enjoyed the conversations. If we've got anything wrong, let us know. We want to hear your opinions. And if you've got any suggestions for next week's topics, then please let us know ASAP and we'll start having a look at them. Although, of course, the thing to remember is we need to have a little disagreement on it to be able to get going. So from myself, Theo, Hewson Bets, thank you very, very much for listening. We hope to see you again soon. And Alex, why don't you sign us out?
So yeah, thank you very much for listening.